And Donald Trump is the most immature president we have ever had.
Yet last night, when it mattered, Democrats ignored their own warnings. Either their memories are short or their principles are situational.
Chuck Schumer thought he was about to have his big moment. You know the type, where a politician steps up to the microphone, delivers what they think is a devastating blow, and waits for the applause. Schumer stood on the Senate floor, pointed his finger, and called Donald Trump the most immature president we have ever had. Bold words, strong words, the kind of words that get clipped and shared a million times on social media. But here's the thing about throwing punches in politics. Sometimes someone punches back harder, and that's exactly what happened when Senator John Barrasso stepped up and absolutely dismantled Schumer's entire argument using nothing but the Democrats' own words against them. What followed was one of those rare moments of brutal honesty on the Senate floor that cuts through all the noise and exposes exactly what's really going on in Washington. If you're tired of political theater and want to see politicians held accountable to their own statements, you're in the right place. We just launched this channel and we're focused entirely on debates, raw, unfiltered, and real. If you believe truth isn't partisan, hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because this one's going to be good. So let's set the scene here. This was the first day of what turned out to be the longest government shutdown in recent memory. Chuck Schumer is at the podium, and he's going off. He's talking about how the American people are being used as pawns, how Trump is using blackmail tactics, how this whole thing is gonna fall squarely on Republican backs. He's animated, he's passionate, and he's clearly playing to the cameras. And look, that's politics, right? You get up there, you make your case, you try to win the news cycle. But Schumer made a critical mistake. He assumed nobody would actually check the receipts. He assumed that in the chaos of a government shutdown, people would just take his word for it that Democrats were the good guys fighting for the little guy while those evil Republicans held the country hostage.
All we are doing is reflecting what the American people already want. Nothing more, nothing less. They want us to sit down and negotiate something real that takes this huge, huge burden off their shoulders. And Donald Trump, instead of acting like an adult, he's the most immature president we have ever had. Instead of doing something to stop the healthcare crisis, is threatening to hurt countless hardworking Americans. Donald Trump says it loud and clear. That's one thing about him. He is using the American people as pawns, threatening pain on the country as blackmail. Well, that's not going to work. The American people, it's so easy to see through those tactics. They know this is the Trump shutdown. They know Republicans control the presidency, the Senate, and the House. And what is done during a shutdown will fall squarely on the Republicans' back. Donald Trump even says it. He says he is going to close down all these things people want. It's going to fall right on his back.
But John Barrasso had other plans, and what he did next was absolutely surgical. See, Barrasso didn't come to that debate with talking points. He came with quotes, direct quotes, from Chuck Schumer himself, from Patty Murray, from Elizabeth Warren, from Chris Murphy, from Amy Klobuchar, from Brian Schatz. He had the receipts, and he was ready to read every single one of them out loud on the Senate floor for the whole country to hear. And the picture those quotes painted? Well, let's just say it wasn't flattering for the Democrats.
Well, Senate Democrats have now dragged us into the Schumer shutdown. When I say us, I mean all of us as Americans. Didn't have to happen. And then it certainly doesn't need to continue. Americans are overwhelmingly against the shutdown of our government. This is a direct attack on hardworking American taxpayers who voted against wasteful Washington spending in the elections in November.
Here's what makes this so devastating. Barrasso pointed out that during Joe Biden's time in office, there were 13 continuing resolutions, 13 that kept the government running. Every single one of them passed with bipartisan support. The minimum number of votes on any of those? 65. That's not partisan gridlock, that's cooperation. That's both sides saying, look, we might disagree on a lot, but we're not gonna hurt American families over it. So what changed? Why, when it was time to vote on essentially the same level of spending that Democrats had approved repeatedly under Biden, did they suddenly decide to vote no? The answer, if you're being honest, is pretty obvious. The calendar changed, elections were coming, and suddenly, a government shutdown wasn't a crisis to be avoided. It was an opportunity to be exploited.
Think back to previous continuing resolutions just like this one. Can think back to 13 of them during the time Joe Biden was in office at the White House. 13 of these passed. The minimum number of votes was 65. We voted to keep the government open, bipartisan. When Joe Biden and Barack Obama were president, Democrats said shutdowns were dangerous, destructive, and desperate. That's the word of the Democrats.
Now, I want to be clear here because this is important. I'm not saying every single Democrat who voted against the continuing resolution was doing it for cynical political reasons. There are probably some lawmakers who genuinely believed they were taking a principled stand on healthcare subsidies or whatever justification they were using at the time. But when you look at the pattern, when you look at the timing, when you look at the statements coming from Democratic leadership, it's really hard to come to any other conclusion. This was strategy, plain and simple. Don't believe me? Let's look at what they actually said. Catherine Clark, who's in House Democratic leadership, literally admitted out loud, on the record, that shutdowns are one of the few leverage times we have. She acknowledged that families would suffer. She said shutdowns are terrible. And then she basically said, but hey, we need leverage, so here we are. That's not a principled stand. That's a calculation. That's saying the quiet part out loud. Chuck Schumer himself said in early October, every day gets better for us. Think about that for a second. The government is shut down. Federal workers aren't getting paychecks. Essential services are disrupted. And the Senate Minority Leader is out there saying every day gets better for his party. What does that tell you about priorities? And this is where Barrasso's approach was so brilliant. He didn't need to make accusations. He didn't need to spin or exaggerate. All he had to do was read their own words back to them. It's like when your friend swears they never said something, and then you pull up the text message. There's no arguing with that. The words are right there. Let's go through some of these because they're genuinely incredible. Chuck Schumer previously said, and I quote, passing a clean CR would avert a harmful and unnecessary government shutdown. He also said that if the government shuts down, it'll be average Americans who suffer the most. Those are his words. His words. And then when the moment came, he voted to shut it down anyway. Patty Murray, who literally chairs the Appropriations Committee, the committee responsible for government funding, said that a shutdown solves nothing and hurts everyone. Then she voted for one. Elizabeth Warren said that shutdowns are the last resort for those who can't otherwise win their fights through elections and can't win their fights in Congress. Read that again. She literally called it a tactic for losers, and then she used it herself.
Listen to those words. Listen to what Chuck Schumer said. He said, passing a clean CR would avert a harmful and unnecessary government shutdown. He also said if a government shuts down, it'll be average Americans who suffer the most. But yesterday, he stood here in the well and then voted to shut down the government. Senator Patty Murray of Washington is the top Democrat on the Senate Appropriations Committee. She has said a shutdown solves nothing. She went on to say, and it hurts everyone. Yesterday, she voted to shut down the government. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts said that a shutdown, quote, is the last resort for those who can't otherwise win their fights through elections and can't win their fights in Congress. Well, yesterday, she voted to shut down the government.
Chris Murphy said there's a time and a place to debate healthcare, but not when the funding of the federal government and all the lives that are impacted by it hang in the balance. Beautiful sentiment, really touching, and completely ignored when it came time to vote. Amy Klobuchar said shutdowns are not good for the economy. Brian Schatz said he's seen the same thing over and over again, and that shutdowns don't work, and Americans have a lot to lose. Every single one of them voted for the shutdown anyway, so what are we supposed to make of this? Either these senators had some kind of collective amnesia where they forgot everything they'd ever said about government shutdowns, or, and I think this is more likely, their principles are situational. They apply when it's convenient. They disappear when the political calculus changes.
Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut said, quote, there is a time and a place to debate health care, but not when the funding of the federal government and all the lives that are impacted by it hang in the balance. Well, yesterday, he voted to shut down the government. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota is a member of the Senate Democrat leadership. She said, shutdowns are not good for the economy. Yesterday, she voted to shut down the government. Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii said, I've seen the same thing over and over again. He said, shutdowns don't work, no one wins, but Americans have a lot to lose. Yesterday, he voted to shut down the government. Those were Senate Democrat words when there was a Democrat in the White House. Yet last night, when it mattered, Democrats ignored their own warnings. Either their memories are short or their principles are situational.
And look, I get it. Politics is a rough business. Everyone plays games to some degree, but there's something particularly frustrating about watching politicians lecture everyone about principles and then abandon those principles the moment it becomes advantageous to do so. It's the hypocrisy that gets people. It's not even the policy disagreements. Reasonable people can disagree on policy. It's the sanctimony combined with the complete lack of consistency. And here's what's really concerning about this whole approach. When politicians treat government shutdowns as leverage, when they see them as opportunities rather than crises, real people get hurt. We're talking about federal workers who suddenly don't know when their next paycheck is coming. We're talking about families dealing with uncertainty and stress during the holidays. We're talking about essential services getting disrupted. These aren't abstract concepts. These are people's lives, and using them as bargaining chips while simultaneously claiming to be the party that cares about working families. That's a tough circle to square. But wait, there's more, because this isn't just about one shutdown. This is about a pattern. We saw the same playbook in California with Proposition 50. Instead of explaining what the measure actually did on its merits, they framed it entirely as a stand against Trump. The specifics didn't matter. The details didn't matter. All that mattered was the tribal signaling. Are you with us or against us? And that approach worked. Turnout showed it. This is the modern political playbook in action. You manufacture a crisis, or you take an existing situation and frame it as a crisis. You generate headlines and sound bites that play well on the evening news. Those fragments get blasted across media, and by the time anyone bothers to look at the full picture, it doesn't matter anymore. The narrative is set, the talking points have been established, and trying to correct the record at that point is like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. We saw this constantly during Trump's first term, and here we are again. The faces might change slightly, but the playbook stays the same. And if you think this is the last shutdown we're gonna see, I've got bad news for you. There's already talk about potential funding issues at the end of January, so buckle up because this ride isn't over. Here's where it gets interesting. If you're a Democrat watching this, you might be thinking, well, Republicans do this stuff too. And you know what? Fair point. Politicians from both parties have been known to play games with government funding when it suits them. But that's kind of the whole point, isn't it? We should be calling it out, whoever does it. The principle should matter more than the party. When Barrasso stood up there and read those quotes, he wasn't making a Republican argument. He was making an accountability argument. He was saying, you said this, you believe this, what changed? The answer, of course, is nothing changed except the political situation. The principle itself was always negotiable. It was always about power and leverage, not about actually protecting American families from the disruption of a government shutdown. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start noticing it everywhere. The carefully crafted outrage, the strategic timing, the convenient memory lapses. So what do we do with this information? Well, for starters, we pay attention, we remember, we hold receipts just like Barrasso did. When a politician tells you something is an absolute principle that can never be violated, bookmark that statement, screenshot it, because there's a decent chance you're gonna need it later when they violate that same principle for political convenience. We also need to demand better, not just from one party, but from everyone. The bar for political leadership has dropped so low that simply being consistent seems like too much to ask. But it shouldn't be. We should expect that when someone tells us shutdowns are harmful and hurt average Americans, they actually mean it, not just when their party is in the White House. At the end of the day, this whole episode is a perfect illustration of why trust in political institutions is at rock bottom. People aren't stupid. They can see when they're being played. They can tell when principles are just talking points dressed up in fancy language. And every time a politician says one thing and does another, that trust erodes a little bit more. What did you think about Barrasso's takedown? Did the Democrats have a legitimate point, or was this pure political theater? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this. If this kind of content is what you're looking for, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. We're going to keep covering these debates, exposing the contradictions, and cutting through the political noise. And remember, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, keep thinking, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep those receipts.